You're still awake when you should already be in bed. The house has that late night quiet where you can hear the clock more than you can hear yourself. The refrigerator has settled down and is humming. The heat has stopped cycling. The only steady sound is the tick on the wall, and it feels louder because there's nothing competing with it. You check the time without thinking about it. It's past midnight. You look out the window. The sky is dark and the moon is gone. There's no silver edge, no light, just black. You've been carrying something all day, a decision you didn't want to make, a message you didn't want to send, a conversation you keep rehearsing because you're sure you're right, and you're also sure it's going to start trouble. This is the hour when people do things they wouldn't do at noon, not because they're brave, because no one is watching. Now, because the house is quiet, you can convince yourself that if you do it now, you'll sleep. In folk magic, there are moments that don't cooperate. You can still act, but you don't get to be surprised when the thing you started doesn't go where you thought it would go. But you tell yourself it's fine. You're not lighting candles. You're not doing a ritual. You're just fixing a problem. So you do it. You send a magical message. Or you make the call. You say the thing you've been holding back. And you put it in motion. It feels like relief for about 2 minutes. Then you notice the clock again. Tick, tick, tick. And then a few days later, you realize the situation didn't resolve. It didn't calm down. It didn't end. It got sticky. It turned into follow-ups. It turned into explanations. It turned into that feeling where you keep checking your phone because you can tell you started something that isn't going to settle down on its own. And that's when you remember what you didn't want to remember at midnight. Some moments aren't meant for action. Some moments are for leaving things alone. And if you insist on acting anyway, you might not get what you wanted. I'm Papa G, and this is the Feral Folklorist. And tonight we're talking about witching hours, how folk magic uses timing, why the moon and the clock both matter, and what happens when you act in the wrong moment. Witching hours have a reputation now that's mostly modern. People picture a certain time on the clock, usually 3 a.m., and they attach it to ghost stories and horror movies and internet lists. That version is loud and theatrical. It's also not the most useful way to understand where the idea came from. In older folk belief, witching hour wasn't a brand. It was a warning label. A lot of folk magic isn't about summoning anything. It's about not making things worse. That's the part that gets lost when the topic turns into spooky entertainment. Most traditional timing rules are caution rules. They exist because people notice patterns, and they passed those patterns down and treated them like common sense because the consequences were expensive. The oldest timing system most people can track with tools is the moon. You can stand outside and see it. You can tell if the light is growing or shrinking. You can tell when it disappears. And that matters in folk magic because the moon gives you a visible schedule for increase, decrease, and pause. In European folk practice, you see the waxing moon linked with increase, crops or money or luck, fertility, attraction. You see the waning moon linked with reduction, things like illness or bad habits, or enemies or debt or unwanted attention. If you were trying to make something grow while the light was visibly shrinking, you were choosing a harder fight. Appalachian household lore carried the same structure, even when people didn't use formal astrology language. You'll hear it in the way people talk about planting, cutting hair, curing meat, or starting projects or finishing projects. Folks paid attention to what time did to outcomes. They used the moon the way they use the weather. So in Conjure, especially in the South, lunar timing shows up alongside other timing systems. Some workers keep it simple: waxing for drawing, waning for sending off, and dark moon for restraint. Others layer it with day of the week timing, time of the day timing, and kinds of practical rules you can only develop when you've watched a spell go sideways and had to deal with the aftermath. And the dark moon is where the witching hour idea starts to feel real. Not because it's spooky, because it's a pause you can feel. The moon has pulled back. The visible light is gone. In a lot of traditions, that window isn't treated as the best time to start big work. It's treated as a time to wait, hold, and keep your hands off a situation unless you know exactly what you're doing. That keep your hands off part is a common thread across many regions. The language of the land may change, but the rule stays the same. Then you have day of the week timing. This shows up all over because the 7-day cycle is a shared structure. Even when people don't talk about planets, they still treat some days as better for some things than others. In Christian-rooted folk practice, Sunday is often treated differently because it's the day set aside. In Conjure, you'll find people using certain days for certain goals. But what matters more is that day of the week timing creates a rhythm that keeps people from acting impulsively. It gives you a reason to wait until Tuesday or Friday or Saturday instead of doing something at 1 a.m. because you're upset. Time of the day timing is older than clocks. Before mechanical clocks were common, people time work by daylight and dark. Dawn, midday, dusk, and night. Those were the boundaries. Dawn is a start point. Dusk is a settling point. And night is private time. Midnight is a hinge point in the middle of the night, where many traditions treat it as a dividing line. Not because it was a time where ghosts came out or hauntings happened, but because it split one day from the next. Now, once mechanical clocks became common, that hinge got sharper. Midnight stopped being a loose stretch of night and became a precise boundary you could hear. That changed household behavior. You see it in death customs, for example. Stopping clocks after a death isn't only about marking the time. In folk belief, it's also about not letting the dead stay tied to the house rhythm. The ticking is the household's pulse. When it stops, something has changed. You also see timing showing up in church-rooted prohibitions and allowances. Certain kinds of work were avoided on certain holy days. Some folks wouldn't do certain acts during Lent, and others avoided starting anything major on days they considered unlucky. So whether you call it religion or tradition, the structure's the same. Timing created boundaries. And then there's another timing method that shows up in homes because it is so simple it doesn't require anyone's permission. The clock hands. Some people don't time by moon phases at all. They time by the direction the big hand is moving. They treat it like a visible sign of increase and decrease. Rising hand for drawing, falling hand for sending off. That's folk logic. You can see it. You can teach it without a book. It fits in a kitchen. It also fits in the way people think when they're doing practical magic. Pick a direction and don't argue with it. So when you put witching hours back into the world it came from, it's less about scary time and more about controlled time. It's about separating moments where you act from moments where you don't. It's about making sure your spells and rituals don't spill into the rest of your life because you started them in the middle of exhaustion and then kept poking at the situation every night after. Witching hours, in the older sense, are hours people learn to treat carefully, not because a monster shows up, because you do. Here's the reality of timing and magic. It's not about being more magical. It's about not creating extra problems. Most bad timing doesn't look like sparks and smoke. It looks like the spell or ritual behaving in a way you didn't plan for. It looks like a situation that should have eased up instead of getting more complicated. It looks like you having to keep addressing the same thing because you didn't give it a proper beginning and a proper end. So when we talk about timing in folk magic, we're really talking about two things. First, choosing a moment that matches what you're trying to do. And second, choosing a moment that matches who you are right then. Because a lot of people do spells and rituals when they're tired or angry or lonely or keyed up. And the night makes that easier. The house is quiet. Nobody interrupts. Your mind starts running and you tell yourself you're finally getting control of the situation. But what you're often doing is feeding it. That's why timing rules survive. They protect you from your own impulse. Moon timing is the easiest place to start because it's visible. You don't need charts to understand the basic rule of growing light supports drawing things in, and shrinking light supports reducing. That dark moon, once again, is a pause, and pauses don't cooperate with jobs that require clear motion. Here's the part people don't say out loud enough. The dark moon can be useful, but it is not forgiving. If you start a spell in that window because you're restless and you want relief, you're more likely to end up with a situation that doesn't travel anywhere. It just stays and hangs around. It keeps demanding attention. It becomes the thing you keep thinking about at night. That's why in practice, many people treat that period of time as a holding time. They let situations sit. They let emotions settle. They stop touching things. If they do ritual during that time at all, it's usually aimed at containment or stopping, not drawing or banishing. And even then, they're careful, because stopping can look like stuck if you aren't precise. Now let's talk about time of day, because that's where a lot of witching hour confusion comes from. Late night is private. It's quiet. It's also when your judgment is more likely to be compromised. People do their worst communication late at night. They send texts that start fights. They make accusations they can't walk back. And they turn things over and over in their head until they pick at the one sentence that hurt them and turn it into an entire argument. If you bring spell and ritual into that same space without discipline, you end up with the same problem. Not because the night is cursed, but because the night is where you keep reopening things. And that's why midnight matters. Midnight is a boundary. If you start a ritual right before the day changes and you finish it right after, you've crossed a line. You've shifted conditions midstream. And that is one of the oldest ways to get a result that feels unstable. The ritual doesn't feel finished because it wasn't finished inside one condition. So we're not talking about superstition here. We're talking about magical structure. A spell or ritual needs containment. It needs an opening and a closing that belong together. If you start it in one mindset and finish it in another, you've changed what you're doing. If you start it calm and finish it frantic because you're checking for results, you've changed it again. That's why checking is one of the biggest timing failures in modern practice. People do a spell, then they keep touching it, then they keep talking about it. They keep looking for signs. They redo it the next night because they didn't get an immediate response. And that creates a loop. And loops are exactly what you were trying to get away from. A lot of old timing lore is really loop prevention. Now let's go back to the clock hand method we mentioned, because it's one of the best folk systems for people who don't want to use charts or don't want to overthink things. Some practitioners time by the big hand the way you would time by the tides. When the minute hand is rising, moving from the bottom of the clock up towards the top, people treat that as a time to draw things in. That's for calling in, for pulling something closer, or for building things. And when that minute hand is falling past midnight or noon, moving from the top down towards the bottom position, people treat that as sending off, for reducing, for letting go, or for pushing something out. It's simple, and that's why it lasts. You can look up and know what direction you're moving in. You can also stop yourself from doing something reckless by waiting for the hand to turn. And that's where timing becomes discipline again. Then there are more technical timing systems that people use, especially in ceremonial traditions and in older European methods. There are planetary hours. Not everyone uses them, not everyone needs them, but the reason they exist is easy to understand. They're a way to get more precise than just Tuesday. They let you time the tone of a spell or a ritual inside the day. Some people swear by them, and others completely ignore them. Either way, the impulse is the same. People want their timing to match their intent, and precision feels safer. You also see body timing showing up in folk practice. Not always as formal astrology, but as rules tied to bleeding, to healing, teeth pulling, and certain types of medical work. The general idea is that you don't want to do head-related work when pressure is believed to be in the head. You don't want to provoke blood and swelling when the conditions are thought to support that. Whether you agree with it or not, the point is about that timing rules were used to reduce risk when it comes to medical things. And then you have seasonal timing and weather timing, which is where Appalachian household and conjure beliefs often overlap. There's storms and high winds and sudden temperature drops. Those conditions mattered in older practice. Some households avoided starting certain rituals during storms because storms are already instability. They already change mood or sleep or people's nerves. They always brought risk with them. Now, other households use storms for certain kinds of work because storms moved things, and movement is a tool. But the key is that weather was treated as part of a timing environment. So when you pull all of this together, you end up with a real picture of timing and folk magic. It isn't one rule. The moon gives you a monthly rhythm. The clock gives you an hourly boundary. The hands give you visible direction. And the day gives you a weekly structure. And the season gives you a yearly pressure. All of it is aimed for the same practical outcome. Don't make your spell or ritual harder than it has to be. Don't do it when your judgment is compromised. And don't start something you can't stop. Because if you ignore timing, the most common consequence is not failure. It's the cleanup work afterwards. Timing lore survives because it shows up in the kind of stories people tell to stop you from repeating their mistakes. There's an Appalachian warning that gets told in plain language. Don't start important talk after midnight. In one Eastern Tennessee version, a man waits until the house is quiet to confront a family member about money. He does it late so nobody else will hear. And the next morning, the argument isn't contained to that room anymore. The person he spoke to repeats it, but not the same way it was said. And by the end of the week, it is split into multiple fights, and the original issue is buried under the damage. That story ends the same way every time. Nobody announces a new rule. It just becomes understood that certain conversations don't happen in the middle of the night. This can also lead to arguments. This is possibly where we get the phrase of not going to bed angry. Because you don't start conversations late at night that may lead to an argument. In conjure circles, there's a different kind of warning about late night work. Don't lay down trouble when you're full of trouble. One Delta account tells of someone trying to push a situation off them when it was late and they were angry and they were exhausted. And afterwards, they couldn't sleep for nights. They kept getting up to check the door. They kept looking out the window. They kept going back to the same spot outside, like they'd left something there. Nothing ever arrived, but the habit sure did. They trained their body to wake at that hour and look for proof. That ending is never dramatic. It's a stubborn sort of energy. So you learn to stop doing magic after midnight when these things happen. Instead, you go to bed because you get tired of living within the same magical loop. In other words, you've learned your lesson about when to do certain types of magic. Now, in British and Irish folk belief, there are between times, warnings that show up around thresholds and roads. Now, common form is the caution against standing at the door or gate at a certain hour while waiting for a sign. The story usually involves someone in grief or worry, watching the dark too long. A creak becomes the answer, or a bird becomes a message. A shadow becomes certainty. And the consequence is that person starts reading everything as instruction, and they can't turn it off. They think everything is an omen, everything is a sign. The way to end it is a behavioral change. Stop waiting in doorways, stop watching the road, and stop going out at a certain hour looking for an omen. Because all it will do is make your mind run hot. Now, in mountain practice, there are timing stories tied to the body. Midwives and some healers pass down rules about when to not cut or pull or open anything if it could wait. Then there's that clock hand method. And this one is about as household as it gets. You'll find people who don't keep track of moon phases, but they do keep track of that big hand and that rising hand for drawing, like we said before, and falling hand for sending off. It's said like fact. And in some families, it becomes a rule for speech as much as for spells. If you're trying to bring something back together, you don't start the talk while the hand is dropping. And if you're trying to end something, you don't start it while the hand is climbing. The stories that attach to this are always about somebody doing the opposite and watching it turn into a longer mess. The apology becomes another fight, or the goodbye becomes months of contact afterwards. That final word becomes an opening. And the reason these stories stick is because the consequences are so familiar. It's repetition. A situation starts showing up at the same hour over and over until you change what you do at that hour. That's the pressure underneath all timing lore. Not a rule for the sake of rules. a warning meant to keep you from turning one moment into a habit you can't break. So when timing shows up in folk magic, it usually shows up after somebody learned the hard way that impulse has a cost. That's why so many of these traditions don't start with a spell. They start with a rule. They start with a refusal, and they start with the idea that you don't do certain things at certain hours because you don't want the consequences living in your house afterwards. One of the simplest timing-based rituals you'll find isn't fancy at all. It's built for people who keep reaching for the phone after midnight, people who keep reopening the same situation because the night makes everything feel so urgent. The way it's remembered is plain. If you want something to grow, you wait until the time is moving upward. That can mean the moon is growing again. It can also mean the big hand is rising on the clock. The point is that you chose a direction and you don't contradict yourself. So the person writes what they want to say before the hour gets late, not to send it, just to get it out of their head. They fold the paper and set it somewhere they will see in the morning. Then they leave it alone while the night passes, because the night is when people turn one message into 10. And when the morning comes, they read it again in the daylight. If it still needs to be said, they wait for a rising moment and they speak then. If it doesn't, they let it die on the page. Either way, the ritual has a closing. The message doesn't get sent in the hour that makes people reckless. And when someone is trying to shed a situation, they do the opposite. They wait for a falling moment. They say what needs to be said, and they stop. They don't circle back at 1 a.m. They don't rewrite it 10 different ways. They don't keep returning to the same doorway. That's the folk logic underneath witching hours. It's not about waiting till 3 a.m. to meet your coven out in the woods. It's about giving your trouble a regular appointment. If you can't stop yourself from acting at the wrong hour, timing becomes the boundary that can stop you. I'm Papa G, and this has been the Feral Folklorist. Next time we're talking about Medusa. We're looking at why folks used to hang a symbol of her screaming face on their front door to protect the home and stop a curse from entering, and how we can find the courage to stare back at things that mean you harm. But for now, just remember, the clock doesn't stop just because you're in a hurry. Check your signs, look at the moon, and always make sure the world is ready for the work you're about to do. If you'd like to hear the After the Show episode where I go deeper into the folklore, spill a little extra dirt, and sometimes rant just a bit, consider becoming a patron over on my Patreon at patreon.com/PapaG. You can find the official site for the podcast at feralfolklorist.com. And if you need spell supplies for any of the workings we talk about on the show, our metaphysical shop, Aromagees Botanica, has been weaving magic for over 25 years. That's over at aromagees.com.